The dust settled on the fresh earth like whispered prayers, and Ophelia Zimmerman's tears fell harder than the summer rain that never came to Green River, Wyoming. She knelt beside the wooden cross that marked where they had buried Thomas 3 days ago, her black dress pooling around her in the dirt, her gloved hands clutching at the dry ground as if she could dig down through 6 feet of earth and pull him back to her. The cemetery sat on a hill overlooking the sprawling valley below, where cattle grazed and the Green River wound its lazy path through the sagebrush. And she had come here every day since they lowered his pine coffin into the ground, unable to stay away, unable to move forward. "Madam, you are going to make yourself sick out here in this heat." The voice came from behind her, deep and careful, the kind of voice that knew grief when it saw it. Ophelia did not turn around. She had heard footsteps approaching, but had not cared enough to acknowledge them. What did it matter who saw her like this? Thomas was gone, shot down during a bank robbery he had tried to stop, and her world had shattered into pieces too small to ever put back together. "Please, just leave me alone," she whispered, her voice breaking on the last word. She was 24 years old, married for only 2 years, and now she was a widow in a harsh land where women without men struggled to survive. The ranch they had been building together would likely go to auction. The life they had planned would never happen. Everything felt impossibly hollow. "I cannot do that." The man moved closer, and she heard him remove his hat. "My name is Zachary Garrison. I worked with your husband at the lumber mill last winter. Thomas was a good man, one of the best I ever knew. I am truly sorry for your loss." Ophelia finally turned her head, squinting up through her tears at the tall figure silhouetted against the bright June sky. Zachary Garrison stood well over 6 feet, broad-shouldered and lean in the way of men who worked hard for their living. He had dark hair that fell almost to his collar, a strong jaw shadowed with stubble, and eyes the color of storm clouds. He held his weathered hat in his hands, turning it slowly, his expression genuinely sorrowful. "Thank you," she managed, wiping at her face with the back of her hand. "That is kind of you to say." "It is the truth." Zachary crouched down beside her, his boots creaking, his voice gentle. "Madam, I know this is not what you want to hear right now, but you cannot stay out here like this. You have been here since dawn. The sun is only getting hotter, and you have not eaten or had water. Thomas would not want this for you." "How would you know what Thomas would want?" The words came out sharper than she intended, born of pain rather than genuine anger. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "He is gone. He left me alone in this terrible world, and I do not know how to do this without him." Zachary was quiet for a long moment, letting her words hang in the dry air. A hawk circled overhead, its cry lonely and distant. Finally he spoke again, his voice low and honest. "You are right. I cannot know exactly what Thomas would want. But I know he loved you more than anything. He talked about you constantly at the mill, about the ranch you were building, about the family you wanted to have, about how lucky he was that you had agreed to marry him. And I know that a man who loved someone that much would want her to keep living, even after he was gone." Ophelia pressed her hands to her face, sobbing harder. Everything Zachary said was true. Thomas had been full of dreams and plans, always talking about their future, always making her laugh even when times were hard. He had been her best friend and her great love, and now there was just this gaping emptiness where he used to be. "I do not know how," she whispered through her tears. "I do not know how to keep going. Let me help you." Zachary's words were simple and direct, without pretense or expectation. "Let me help you live again, not today and not tomorrow, but slowly, one day at a time. You do not have to do this alone." She lowered her hands and looked at him properly for the first time. His face was weathered from years of outdoor work, lined around the eyes from squinting against the sun, but there was kindness there, and something else she could not quite name. Sincerity, perhaps. Or maybe just the recognition of one wounded soul seeing another. "Why would you do that?" she asked. "You barely know me." "Because Thomas would have done the same for me if our situations were reversed," Zachary said simply. "And because no one should have to face grief alone. I lost my younger brother 2 years ago in a ranching accident. I know what it feels like to have the ground disappear beneath your feet. I know what it is like to wonder if the pain will ever stop." Ophelia studied his face and saw the truth of his words written in the shadows behind his eyes. He understood, not in the way people who offered hollow condolences understood, but in the way of someone who had walked through the same darkness and somehow found his way back to the light. "I do not need charity," she said quietly, but without the earlier sharpness. "I can take care of myself." "I am not offering charity," Zachary replied. "I am offering friendship. Help with the ranch if you need it, someone to talk to if you want it, or just someone to make sure you eat a proper meal now and then. That is all, nothing more than what Thomas would have wanted for you." The mention of Thomas's name in that context, spoken with such respect and care, broke something loose in Ophelia's chest. She nodded slowly, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Zachary stood and extended his hand to her. After a moment's hesitation, she took it, letting him help her to her feet. Her legs were stiff from kneeling so long, and she swayed slightly. His hand steadied her elbow, careful and respectful. "There is a cafe down on Main Street," he said. "Mrs. Patterson makes a good stew. Let me buy you some lunch, and then I will walk you home. You need food and rest." Ophelia wanted to refuse, wanted to stay here by Thomas's grave where she felt closest to him, but her body betrayed her with a wave of dizziness. She had not eaten more than a few bites in days, and the Wyoming sun was merciless. She nodded again, and Zachary retrieved his horse from where he had tied it to the cemetery fence. He did not offer to help her mount, sensing perhaps that she needed to do some things on her own, but he walked slowly beside her down the hill toward town, leading his horse and giving her time to compose herself. Green River spread out before them, a cluster of wooden buildings along the river's edge, dusty streets busy with wagons and horses and people going about their daily business. The town had grown rapidly in recent years, thanks to the railroad and the coal mines, and it felt strange to Ophelia that life continued as normal when her own had stopped so completely. How could people laugh and talk and buy supplies when Thomas was in the ground? How could the world keep turning? But it did. It always did. That was perhaps the cruelest part of grief, the way it isolated you in your pain while everyone else moved on. Mrs. Patterson's cafe was a small building with gingham curtains and the smell of fresh bread wafting from inside. Zachary held the door open for Ophelia, and several heads turned as they entered. A widow out with a man so soon after her husband's death would cause talk. But Zachary seemed unconcerned, and Ophelia found she did not have the energy to care. Let them gossip. Nothing they said could hurt more than what she was already feeling. They sat at a corner table, and Mrs. Patterson herself came over, her plump face creased with sympathy. "Oh, Mrs. Zimmerman, I am so sorry about Thomas. Such a tragedy. That poor boy trying to be a hero." She patted Ophelia's shoulder. "You just sit right here, dear, and I will bring you some good hot stew. You look like you could use a proper meal." Ophelia managed a weak smile of thanks, and Mrs. Patterson bustled away, already shouting orders to her daughter in the kitchen. Zachary sat across from her, his large frame somehow fitting comfortably into the small chair, his presence oddly reassuring. He did not try to fill the silence with meaningless chatter, and she appreciated that more than she could say. When the food came, steaming bowls of beef stew thick with vegetables and potatoes, Ophelia stared at it for a long moment before picking up her spoon. The first bite tasted like nothing, but she forced herself to eat because Zachary was right about one thing. She needed food. As she ate, warmth began to spread through her body, and she realized just how weak she had become in the past few days. "Thank you," she said finally, setting down her spoon. She had managed to eat about half the bowl, more than she had eaten in total since the funeral. "I needed this." "You are welcome." Zachary had finished his own meal and was nursing a cup of coffee. "Do you have family here in Green River? Anyone who has been helping you?" Ophelia shook her head. "No. Thomas and I came out here from Missouri 2 years ago. We wanted to start fresh, build something of our own. His parents are dead, and mine are back east. I wrote to them, but it will be weeks before they get the letter." "What about the ranch? Are you planning to keep it?" The question made Ophelia's throat tighten. The ranch was a small spread about 5 miles outside of town, 160 acres with a modest cabin, a barn, and a dozen head of cattle. She and Thomas had worked so hard to build it up, had poured every dollar and every drop of sweat into making it viable. The thought of selling it felt like giving up on Thomas's dream, but the thought of running it alone felt impossible. "I do not know," she admitted. "I do not know if I can manage it by myself. Thomas handled the cattle and the heavy work. I took care of the garden and the chickens in the house. I can ride and I can shoot, but I do not know if that is enough." Zachary leaned forward slightly, his expression thoughtful. If you want to keep it, I can help you. I work at the Rocking H Ranch most days, but I have my evenings and Sundays free. I could help with the cattle, fix anything that needs fixing, teach you what you need to know. You could pay me if you want, or we could work out some kind of trade. Either way, you would not be alone in it. Why are you doing this? Ophelia asked again, searching his face for ulterior motives. In her experience, men rarely offered help without expecting something in return, especially to women alone. But Zachary's expression remained open and honest. Because it is the right thing to do, he said simply. And because I know what it is like to lose someone and feel like you were drowning. After my brother died, I was in a bad way. A neighbor named Frank Morrison saw it and refused to let me sink. He showed up at my door every day for 2 months, made me eat, made me work, made me remember that life was still worth living. I owe him everything. This is me paying that forward. The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable, and Ophelia felt something shift slightly in her chest. Not the lifting of her grief, which still sat heavy and dark, but perhaps the smallest crack in the wall of her isolation. Maybe she did not have to do this completely alone. Maybe accepting help was not the same as being weak or disloyal to Thomas's memory. All right, she said quietly. If you truly mean it, then yes, I would appreciate your help. I do not want to lose the ranch. It was everything to Thomas. Then we will make sure you do not lose it. Zachary's expression softened into something that might have been a small smile, though it was hard to tell through the beard stubble. Do you need anything right now? Supplies? Repairs? Ophelia thought about the ranch, about all the things that had been neglected in the days since Thomas died. The roof on the barn is leaking. Thomas was supposed to fix it, but he never got the chance. And I need to check on the cattle. I have not been out to them in almost a week. Then that is where we will start. Zachary stood and placed a few coins on the table to pay for their meals. Let me ride out with you now. We can look at the barn roof and check on the herd. You should not be going out there alone anyway, not with the way you have been feeling. They left the cafe together, and Ophelia was aware of the eyes following them, the whispers starting already. Sarah Bennett, the banker's wife, stared openly from across the street. Old Mr. Henderson watched from the porch of the general store. Ophelia kept her head high, refusing to show how much their judgment stung. She was not doing anything wrong. She was simply trying to survive. Her horse, a gentle bay mare named Clover, was stabled at the livery near the edge of town. The stable boy, Jimmy, brought her out already saddled, his young face solemn. I am real sorry about Mr. Zimmerman, madam, he said quietly. He always treated me fair. Thank you, Jimmy. Ophelia took Clover's reins and mounted slowly, her body protesting after days of minimal movement. But once she was in the saddle, muscle memory took over, and she felt slightly more like herself. Riding had always been one of her great joys, one of the few things she did simply for the pleasure of it. Zachary mounted his own horse, a tall dun gelding, with a calm disposition, and they rode out of town together at an easy walk. The road to the ranch followed the river for a while, before branching off through rolling grasslands dotted with sagebrush and wildflowers. The afternoon sun beat down relentlessly, and heat waves shimmered in the distance, making the mountains on the horizon seem to dance and waver. They rode in silence for the most part, but it was a comfortable silence, the kind that did not need to be filled with words. Ophelia found herself studying Zachary from the corner of her eye, taking in details she had missed before. He sat his horse with the easy grace of someone who had spent his whole life in the saddle. His clothes were clean but worn, practical rather than fancy. He wore a gun belt, which was common enough in Wyoming, but the gun itself looked well maintained and frequently used. Not the weapon of someone who wore it for show, but of someone who knew how to use it if necessary. How long have you been in Green River? She asked finally, breaking the silence. About 3 years, Zachary replied. I came up from Colorado after my brother died. I needed a change of scenery, a place where I was not constantly being reminded of him. I hired on at the Rocking H, and I have been there ever since. Good outfit, fair boss. The work is hard but honest. Do you have other family? My parents are still alive, down in Colorado Springs. I write to them regularly, visit when I can. I have a sister too, married with 3 kids. She is the sensible one in the family. There was warmth in his voice when he spoke of his sister, and Ophelia felt a pang of envy. She had been an only child, and sometimes the loneliness of that had been overwhelming. "It must be nice having family nearby," she said softly. "It is," Zachary agreed. "Though I will admit I do not see them as often as I should. The ranch keeps me busy, especially during calving season and roundup. But we make it work." He glanced over at her. "What about you? Do you have siblings?" "No, just me. My parents had hoped for more children, but it never happened. They wanted me to marry someone in our town, someone established and safe. When I met Thomas and decided to come west with him, they were not happy. We have not spoken much since I left." Saying it aloud made it sound even sadder than it felt. She had traded her family for a future with Thomas, and now Thomas was gone and she was alone. "That must be hard," Zachary said, his voice gentle. "But for what it is worth, I think what you and Thomas did took real courage. Building a new life from scratch is not easy. Most people never try." They crested a rise, and Ophelia's ranch came into view in the valley below. The cabin was small but sturdy, built from pine logs chinked with mud, with a stone chimney on one end. The barn stood a short distance away, weathered wood silver gray in the sunlight. The corral was empty, the cattle likely out, grazing in the pastures beyond. Ophelia felt her heart constrict at the sight of it. This was the home she and Thomas had built together. Every log, every nail, every fence post represented their shared dreams. Coming back here without him felt impossible. Zachary must have sensed her distress because he spoke quietly. "We can take this as slow as you need. If you want to turn back, we can." "No?" Ophelia straightened her shoulders. "No, I need to do this. I need to see it." They rode down to the ranch, and Ophelia dismounted in front of the cabin with shaking legs. Everything looked the same as it had the morning of the day Thomas died. His hat still hung on the peg by the door. His jacket was draped over the porch railing where he had left it. The sight of these small, everyday objects made tears spring to her eyes again, but she forced them back. She had cried enough for one day. Zachary tied both horses to the hitching post and joined her on the porch. "Show me the barn first," he suggested. "We can look at that roof." Grateful for the distraction, Ophelia led him to the barn. Inside, it was dim and cool, smelling of hay and livestock. The leak was obvious, a dark stain on the floor where rainwater had dripped through. And when Zachary climbed up to look, he found several shingles missing or damaged. "It is fixable," he called down to her. "I can do it this Sunday if the weather holds. I will bring shingles and tar from town. It should not take more than a few hours." "I can pay you for the materials," Ophelia said. She did not have much money, but she had enough for necessary repairs. "We will worry about that later." Zachary climbed back down the ladder, brushing hay and dust from his clothes. "Now, let us go check on those cattle." They rode out to the east pasture, where Ophelia's small herd was grazing near a creek. Zachary counted them carefully, looking them over with a practiced eye. "They all look healthy," he reported. "Good weight, no signs of illness. You have been taking good care of them." "Thomas did most of the work," Ophelia said. "I just helped. You are giving yourself too little credit. Cattle do not stay healthy by accident. You know what you are doing." Zachary turned his horse back toward the cabin. "You have the makings of a solid ranch here, Mrs. Zimmerman. With some work and care, you could build this into something really fine." "Mrs. Zimmerman." The formality of it struck Ophelia suddenly, the way it created distance between them. But then again, perhaps that was appropriate. They barely knew each other after all, and she was newly widowed. People would already be talking about their lunch together. Too much familiarity would only make it worse. Still, as they rode back to the cabin and Zachary spent another hour checking fences and gates, making a mental list of what needed attention, Ophelia found herself grateful for his presence. The ranch felt less empty with another person there. The silence was less oppressive, and for the first time since Thomas died, she felt a tiny spark of something that might eventually grow into hope. Maybe she could do this. Maybe with help, she could keep the ranch running and honor Thomas's memory by making their dream succeed. When the sun began to dip toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, Zachary prepared to leave. "I will come back on Sunday to fix that roof," he said, mounting his horse. "In the meantime, if you need anything at all, send word to the Rocking H. Someone will find me." "Thank you," Ophelia said, and this time she meant it fully, without reservation. "Thank you for everything today. I do not think I could have done this alone." "You are stronger than you think," Zachary replied. "But you do not have to be strong alone. Remember that." He touched the brim of his hat in farewell and rode off. his figure growing smaller as he headed back toward town and the rocking H beyond. Ophelia stood on the porch long after he disappeared, watching the sunset paint the sky. The ache in her chest had not lessened, and she knew it would not for a long time. Grief was not something you got over quickly. But Zachary's words echoed in her mind. Let me help you live again. Not forget, not move on as if Thomas had never existed, but simply live. Keep breathing, keep moving forward, one small step at a time. She went inside as darkness fell, lit a lamp, and made herself eat a piece of bread and cheese, even though she was not hungry. Then she sat at the table she and Thomas had built together, and for the first time since his death, she allowed herself to think about the future instead of dwelling on the past. She thought about the ranch, about the cattle, about all the work that needed to be done. She thought about Zachary's offer to help, about the kindness in his eyes and the understanding in his voice. She thought, too, about the long road ahead of her, about the grief she would have to carry, and the life she would have to rebuild from the ruins of her shattered dreams. It seemed impossible, overwhelming, too much for one person to bear. But then she remembered what Zachary had said about his brother, about the neighbor who had shown up every day until Zachary remembered that life was worth living. Maybe that was what healing looked like. Not some grand transformation, but simply someone showing up day after day, until the darkness began to lift. Ophelia went to bed that night in the cabin that still smelled like Thomas, surrounded by his things and his memory. She cried herself to sleep as she had every night since he died. But underneath the grief, buried deep but unmistakably present, was something new, a fragile thread of possibility, a sense that maybe, just maybe, she would survive this after all. True to his word, Zachary appeared at the ranch early Sunday morning with a wagon full of supplies. Ophelia had spent the previous day cleaning the cabin and trying to keep herself busy, but she had returned to the cemetery in the afternoon, unable to stay away. She had talked to Thomas, told him about Zachary's offer to help, asked him if it was all right for her to accept. The only answer was the wind through the grass and the lonely call of a meadowlark, but somehow it had felt like permission. Now, watching Zachary unload shingles and tar and tools, Ophelia felt a strange mixture of guilt and relief. Guilt because accepting help felt like admitting she could not do everything on her own, like somehow betraying Thomas's faith in her. Relief because the weight of running the ranch alone had been crushing her, and having someone share the burden made it feel survivable. "Good morning," Zachary called, spotting her on the porch. "I hope I did not wake you coming in." "I have been awake for hours," Ophelia replied, which was true. She had not been sleeping well, haunted by dreams of Thomas and waking to the stark reality of his absence. "Can I help with anything?" "You can hand me shingles once I am up there," Zachary said. "But mostly I just need you to stay on the ground and make sure I do not fall off the roof and break my neck. Fair trade?" Despite everything, Ophelia felt her lips twitch in what might have been the beginning of a smile. Fair trade. They worked together for most of the morning, Zachary up on the barn roof in the hot sun, Ophelia handing up materials and watching him work. He moved with practiced efficiency, pulling out damaged shingles and replacing them with new ones, sealing everything carefully with tar. He was good at this, Ophelia realized. Not just competent, but skilled, the kind of person who took pride in doing a job right. Around midday, Ophelia went to the cabin and made sandwiches and lemonade from the supplies she had purchased in town the day before. She brought them out to the barn, and Zachary climbed down, wiping sweat from his forehead. "You did not have to do that," he said, but he accepted the food gratefully and ate with the appetite of a man who had been working hard. They sat in the shade of the barn, not talking much, just resting and eating. It felt oddly domestic, and Ophelia pushed away the guilt that came with that feeling. She was allowed to have moments of peace. She was allowed to accept help without it meaning she had forgotten Thomas. "How is the roof coming?" she asked. "Nearly done. Another hour should finish it. Then it will hold for years, as long as you check it regularly after storms." Zachary took a long drink of lemonade. "I was thinking, if you want, I could come by a few evenings a week to help with other things. Fence repairs, checking the herd, general maintenance. That way, you're not trying to do everything yourself." Ophelia considered this. Part of her wanted to refuse, to insist she could manage on her own. But the practical part of her, the part that remembered how exhausted Thomas had been some evenings after working all day, knew better. "I would appreciate that," she said finally. "But I insist on paying you something. I will not have you working for free." "Then pay me in meals," Zachary suggested. "I am tired of my own cooking, and if your sandwiches are any indication, you are a lot better at it than I am." It seemed like a fair arrangement, and it would give Ophelia something useful to do, a way to contribute. "All right, meals in exchange for help with the ranch. We have a deal." They shook hands on it, and Ophelia felt the calloused roughness of his palm against hers, the firm but gentle grip. It was the first time she had touched another person in days, and the simple human contact was more affecting than she had expected. She pulled her hand back quickly, suddenly aware of how improper this whole situation might look to an outsider. A widow, barely a week out from her husband's funeral, making deals with a cowboy, shaking hands like business partners. The gossips in town would have a field day if they knew. But what choice did she have? She could not run the ranch alone, and she could not afford to hire proper help. Zachary's offer was generous and seemed genuinely without ulterior motive. She would have to trust that people would understand or learn not to care what they thought. Zachary finished the roof repair by mid-afternoon, and true to his word, it looked solid and professionally done. He cleaned up his tools and refused Ophelia's offer to pay for the materials. "Consider it a gift in memory of Thomas," he said. "He would have done the same for me." After he left, Ophelia walked the ranch, looking at everything with new eyes. The fence line that needed repair, the garden that had been neglected and was now choked with weeds, the chicken coop that needed cleaning, the 100 small tasks that made up the daily reality of ranch life. It was overwhelming when looked at all together, but Zachary was right. Taken one day at a time, one task at a time, it was manageable. She spent the rest of the afternoon weeding the garden, her hands in the dirt, the sun on her back. It was hard physical work, but it felt good to be doing something productive, something that did not leave her alone with her thoughts. By the time evening came, her back ached and her hands were filthy, but she had cleared half the garden and felt a small sense of accomplishment. That night, she cooked herself a proper dinner for the first time since Thomas died. Fried chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans from the stores they had put up last fall. She ate at the table by lamplight, and though the chair across from her was painfully empty, she did not cry. She was too tired to cry, and perhaps that was a blessing. Zachary began coming to the ranch 3 evenings a week, arriving after his work at the Rocking H was finished and staying until dark. He repaired fences, moved cattle, fixed the sagging gate on the corral, replaced worn leather on the tack, and taught Ophelia how to do all of these things herself. He never acted like she was helpless or incapable, but he also did not leave her to struggle. It was a careful balance, and Ophelia appreciated his sensitivity more than she could say. In return, she cooked for him hearty meals of beef stew, roast chicken, biscuits and gravy, apple pie made from dried fruit. She set the table for 2 and tried not to think about how wrong it felt to have someone else sitting in Thomas's chair. But as the weeks passed, it began to feel less wrong and more simply different. Zachary was not trying to replace Thomas. He was just a friend, helping her through an impossible time. They talked during those dinners, carefully at first and then more openly as they grew comfortable with each other. Zachary told her about growing up on a ranch in Colorado, about his brother who had died when his horse threw him and he broke his neck, about the months of darkness that followed. Ophelia told him about Missouri, about her strict parents and her sheltered upbringing, about meeting Thomas at a church social, and knowing almost immediately that he was the one she wanted to spend her life with. "He was everything my parents were not," she said one evening in late July, as they sat on the porch after dinner watching the stars come out. "He was adventurous and optimistic and full of dreams. He made me believe that anything was possible if we were willing to work for it. When he asked me to come west with him, I did not hesitate. I knew my parents would be furious, but I did not care. I wanted that life, that adventure." "Do you regret it?" Zachary asked quietly. Ophelia thought about it, really thought about it. "No," she said finally. "Even knowing how it ended, I do not regret it. The 2 years I had with Thomas were the happiest of my life. I would not trade them for anything, even if it meant not having to feel this pain now." Zachary nodded slowly. "That is how I feel about my brother. I would not wish away the years we had together just to avoid the grief of losing him. The love is worth the pain." They sat in companionable silence after that, and Ophelia felt something settle in her chest. This was what she needed, someone who understood, who did not try to rush her through her grief or tell her she should be over it by now. Someone who knew that healing was not linear, that some days would be harder than others, that missing Thomas would never completely go away. As August arrived and the heat became nearly unbearable, Ophelia found herself looking forward to Zachary's visits with an anticipation that made her feel guilty. She told herself it was just because she appreciated the help, because the ranch was looking better than it had in months, because he was teaching her skills she needed to know. But if she was honest with herself, it was more than that. She enjoyed his company. She liked listening to him talk, liked the way he treated her as an equal, liked the quiet strength he brought with him. One evening, as they were mending a section of fence together, Zachary mentioned that the Rocking H was hiring temporary hands for the fall roundup. "They are looking for anyone who can ride and is not afraid of hard work," he said, hammering a post into the ground. "The pay is decent, and it is only for a few weeks. I thought maybe you might be interested." Ophelia paused in her work, surprised. "You think I could do it?" "I know you could do it. You are a good rider. You know how to work cattle, and you are tougher than you give yourself credit for. It would bring in some extra money before winter, and it might be good for you to get off the ranch for a bit, be around other people." The idea was both exciting and terrifying. Ophelia had never worked roundup before, had never done anything like the kind of grueling labor Zachary was describing, but the thought of earning her own money, of proving to herself that she was capable, was appealing, and he was right that she had been isolating herself too much. Other than going to town for supplies once a week, she barely saw anyone except Zachary. "All right," she said slowly. "I will do it. When does it start?" "First week of September. I will put in a good word with the boss, tell him you are reliable." Zachary grinned at her, the first real smile she had seen from him, and Ophelia felt an unexpected flutter in her stomach. He had a nice smile, she realized, one that changed his whole face and made him look younger, less careworn. She looked away quickly, confused by her reaction. She should not be noticing whether Zachary had a nice smile. She was a widow. Thomas had been dead only 2 months. It was far too soon to even think about another man in any way other than as a friend and helper. But she could not deny that something was shifting inside her, some small awakening that scared her as much as it intrigued her. She was starting to feel again, starting to notice the world around her in a way she had not since Thomas died. The sunset looked beautiful instead of bleak. The food she cooked tasted good instead of like ash. And Zachary's presence was something she looked forward to rather than just tolerated. That night, alone in the cabin, Ophelia lay in bed and stared at the ceiling. She felt like she was standing at a crossroads, torn between loyalty to Thomas's memory and the pull toward her own future. Was it wrong to be happy sometimes? Was it disrespectful to laugh at something Zachary said, or to feel that flutter when he smiled at her? She did not know. The unwritten rules of widowhood seemed impossibly complex, and there was no one she could ask for guidance. And finally, she did what she had been doing more and more lately. She talked to Thomas in her mind, imagining what he would say if he could hear her. And the answer that came, whether it was truly Thomas's voice or just her own hope speaking, was clear. "I want you to be happy. I want you to live. Do not waste your life grieving for me." The fall roundup began on a crisp September morning, with the promise of autumn in the air. Ophelia rode out to the Rocking H before dawn, her stomach tight with nerves, her hands gripping the reins too hard. Zachary had told her where to go, what to bring, what to expect, but she still felt wildly unprepared for what lay ahead. The Rocking H was one of the largest ranches in the area, with thousands of acres of grazing land and hundreds of head of cattle. The bunkhouse was a long, low building where the ranch hands lived, and the main house was a sprawling 2-story structure that spoke of the owner's success. Ophelia felt small and out of place as she approached, but Zachary was waiting for her near the corrals, and his presence made everything feel slightly less intimidating. "You are right on time," he said, taking her horse's reins as she dismounted. "The boss wants to meet you before we head out. Come on." He led her to the main house, where Robert Hawkins, the owner of the Rocking H, was standing on the porch. Hawkins was a barrel-chested man in his 50s with gray hair and shrewd eyes. He looked Ophelia up and down with the assessing gaze of someone used to judging livestock and people with equal acuity. "So you are Thomas Zimmerman's widow," he said without preamble. "Garrison here says you can ride and work cattle. That true?" "Yes, sir. Ophelia replied, meeting his eyes directly. I have been helping run my ranch since my husband died. I am not afraid of hard work, Hawkins grunted. I do not care if you are a woman or a widow, long as you can do the job. Roundup is tough work, and I cannot have anyone slowing us down. But Garrison is a good judge of character, and if he vouches for you, that is good enough for me. You will get the same pay as the other temporary hands, $2 a day plus meals. Fair? More than fair, Ophelia said. Thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Hawkins. Do not thank me yet. Wait until after you have spent a week in the saddle chasing ornery cattle through brush and ravines. Then we will see if you are still grateful. But there was a hint of humor in his gruff voice, and Ophelia sensed he was not as harsh as he pretended to be. The roundup crew consisted of about 20 men, a mix of Hawkins's regular hands and temporary hires like Ophelia. She was the only woman, which earned her some curious stares and a few skeptical looks, but no one said anything rude within her hearing. Zachary introduced her around, and most of the men were polite if reserved. They would wait and see if she could pull her weight before they fully accepted her, which seemed fair enough. The work was every bit as hard as Zachary had warned. They started before dawn and worked until after dark, riding through rugged country to gather cattle from the far reaches of the ranch, branding calves, cutting out the animals destined for market. It was exhausting, dirty, sometimes dangerous work. Ophelia's legs ached from hours in the saddle. Her arms were sore from roping and wrestling with stubborn cattle. She went to bed each night in the small tent she had been assigned, too tired to even eat dinner sometimes. But she loved it. There was something deeply satisfying about the physical labor, about testing herself and finding she was capable. The other hands began to warm up to her as they saw she could keep up, that she did not complain, that she handled her share of the work without needing special treatment. By the end of the first week, they were treating her as one of the crew, ribbing her good-naturedly, and including her in their conversations around the campfire at night. Zachary was always nearby, not hovering but present, ready to help if she needed it, but careful not to undermine her in front of the others. Ophelia appreciated his discretion. She knew some of the men would be looking for any excuse to say she could not handle the job, and having Zachary constantly intervening on her behalf would have played right into that narrative. One evening, about 10 days into the roundup, Ophelia was sitting by the fire with a plate of beans and salt pork when one of the older hands, a leathery man named Cal, asked her about her ranch. Zachary says you are holding on to that spread you and your husband started, Cal said, poking at the fire with a stick. That is a hard thing to do alone. It is, Ophelia agreed, but Zachary has been helping me, and I am learning what I need to know. That is good, Cal nodded approvingly. A lot of women would have given up and gone back east. Takes grit to stick it out here. I do not have anywhere else to go, Ophelia said honestly, and I am not ready to give up on what Thomas and I built. Garrison is a good man, another hand chimed in, a younger fellow named Pete. You could do a lot worse for help. There was something in Pete's tone, a knowing quality that made Ophelia suddenly self-conscious. Were people assuming there was something between her and Zachary? The thought made her cheeks heat, and she was grateful for the darkness that hid her blush. He is a good friend, she said carefully. I am very grateful for his help. Friend, Cal repeated, and there was definitely amusement in his voice now. But he did not push it, and the conversation moved on to other topics. Still, Ophelia was left wondering, was there something between her and Zachary? Something more than friendship? And if there was, what did that mean? Was she ready for that? Was it too soon? She did not have answers to any of those questions, so she pushed them aside and focused on the work. But she found herself watching Zachary when she thought he was not looking, noticing the way he moved with such easy confidence, the way he was always kind to the younger hands, the way he sometimes caught her eye across the camp and smiled as if they shared some private joke. The roundup finished in late September, with a final tally that had Hawkins grinning and declaring it one of their best years yet. He paid all the temporary hands in cash, and Ophelia tucked her earnings carefully into her saddlebag, feeling proud of what she had accomplished. She had survived 3 weeks of grueling work, had earned the respect of the crew, and had money to help see her through the winter. It felt like a victory. Zachary rode back toward town with her, the two of them moving at an easy pace through the golden autumn afternoon. The cottonwoods along the river were turning yellow, and the air had a crisp quality that spoke of winter coming. Ophelia felt different than she had 3 weeks ago, stronger somehow, more sure of herself. You did well, Zachary said as they rode. "Better than well, actually. Cal told me you worked harder than half the regular hands." "I had something to prove," Ophelia admitted. "To them, but mostly to myself." "And did you prove it?" "I think so. I know now that I can do hard things, that I am not as fragile as I feared." She glanced over at him. "Thank you for suggesting I do this. I needed it." "You are welcome, but you did all the hard work yourself. I just pointed you in the right direction." They rode in silence for a while, and then Zachary said, almost hesitantly, "There is a dance in town next Saturday, a harvest celebration. I was wondering if you might want to go. With me, I mean. If it is not too soon or too improper or—" He trailed off, and Ophelia felt her heart start to pound. A dance. Together. It was a clear statement of intention, a move from friendship towards something more. Part of her wanted to say yes immediately, but another part, the part still wrapped in grief and guilt, held back. "I do not know," she said slowly. "People are already talking about us, I am sure. Going to a dance together would only make it worse." "Let them talk," Zachary said with unexpected heat. "Let them say whatever they want. You are not doing anything wrong, Ophelia. You are just living your life." It was the first time he had used her first name, and the sound of it on his lips did something to her, made her stomach flip and her breath catch. She realized suddenly that she wanted to go to the dance with him, wanted to feel his hand in hers, wanted to dance and laugh and allow herself to be happy for an evening. Thomas had been dead for 4 months. She would grieve him for the rest of her life. But maybe Zachary was right. Maybe it was time to start living again. "All right," she said, making the decision before she could second-guess herself. "Yes, I will go to the dance with you." Zachary's face broke into that smile again, the one that transformed him, and Ophelia felt an answering warmth bloom in her chest. This was terrifying and wonderful and wrong and right all at the same time. She did not know what was happening between them, did not know where it would lead, but for the first time since Thomas died, she felt genuinely excited about something. She felt alive. The week leading up to the dance seemed to drag by with agonizing slowness. Ophelia threw herself into work around the ranch, preparing for winter, but her mind kept drifting to thoughts of Zachary and what it would feel like to dance with him. She felt guilty about her anticipation, felt like she should be thinking more about Thomas and less about another man. But whenever she visited Thomas's grave, which she still did regularly, she felt nothing but peace. It was as if Thomas himself was giving her permission to move forward, to find happiness again. She went into town on Friday to buy fabric for a new dress. Her mourning blacks were appropriate for everyday life, but she wanted something brighter for the dance, something that reflected the changes she felt happening inside her. The shopkeeper, Mrs. Chen, a Chinese woman who had come to Green River with the railroad workers and stayed to open a dry goods store, helped her select a deep blue calico that matched her eyes. "You look happy," Mrs. Chen observed as she measured out the fabric. "More yourself again. It is good to see." "Thank you," Ophelia said. "I feel a little more myself." "That Zachary Garrison is a good man," Mrs. Chen added. "My husband says he is the most honest cowboy at the Rocking H. You could do worse." Ophelia blinked, surprised by the directness. "We are just friends." "Of course." "But Mrs. Chen's smile suggested she did not believe that for a second. "Just friends who are going to the dance together. I understand completely." Ophelia left the shop with the fabric and went straight home to sew. She worked through the evening and most of the next day, cutting and stitching by lamplight, determined to have the dress finished in time. It had been a while since she had sewn anything other than practical items, and there was something deeply satisfying about creating something beautiful, something just for her. The dress came together better than she had hoped. A simple design with a fitted bodice and a full skirt, but the color was lovely, and it fit her perfectly. She stood in front of the small mirror in the bedroom and barely recognized herself. The woman looking back at her had color in her cheeks and a light in her eyes that had been missing for months. She looked young again, hopeful again. She looked like someone who still had a future. Zachary arrived at the ranch Saturday evening, just as the sun was setting, riding up on his horse dressed in clean clothes, with his hair combed back and his jaw freshly shaven. He looked different out of his work clothes, more refined, and Ophelia felt suddenly shy as she stepped out onto the porch. "You look beautiful," Zachary said, and there was such genuine admiration in his voice that Ophelia felt her cheeks heat. "Thank you. You look very handsome yourself." He helped her mount Clover, and they rode toward town together in the golden light of the dying day. The dance was being held in the largest barn in Green River, one that belonged to the Miller family and was used for community events. By the time they arrived, the barn was already full of people. Lanterns hung from the rafters, providing warm light, and a small band was tuning up in one corner. Heads turned as Ophelia and Zachary entered together, and she was acutely aware of the whispers starting, the speculative glances. She lifted her chin and ignored them, taking Zachary's offered arm and walking into the barn with as much dignity as she could muster. They did not have to wait long before the music started, a lively fiddle tune that got people moving onto the dance floor. Zachary led Ophelia out, and she felt a moment of panic. She had not danced since Thomas died. Would she remember how? Would it feel like a betrayal? But then Zachary's hand was on her waist, and her hand was in his, and they were moving, and it felt nothing like dancing with Thomas. It felt entirely new, entirely its own thing. Zachary was a good dancer, sure-footed and confident, and he guided her easily through the steps. Ophelia found herself laughing as they spun and twirled, the music and movement driving away her worries. They danced several dances, and between dances they stood at the edge of the floor, catching their breath and watching the other couples. Ophelia saw several people she knew from church or from shopping in town, and while some of them still looked disapproving, others smiled and nodded in greeting. Mrs. Patterson from the cafe came over and squeezed Ophelia's hand. "It is good to see you out and about, dear," she said warmly. "Thomas would want you to be happy." Those simple words meant more than the woman could know, and Ophelia felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you," she managed. As the evening wore on, Ophelia found herself relaxing completely. She was having fun, genuine fun, for the first time in months. Zachary was attentive without being possessive, funny without trying too hard, and he looked at her in a way that made her feel seen and valued. Other men asked her to dance, which she had not expected, and she accepted a few times, grateful that people were not treating her like a pariah. But she always found her way back to Zachary, and by the end of the evening, when the band played a slow, sweet waltz, it felt entirely natural to be in his arms, swaying gently to the music. "Thank you for coming with me," Zachary said quietly, his breath warm against her ear. "This has been one of the best nights I have had in a long time." "Me too," Ophelia admitted. "I was so nervous, but I am glad I came. I am glad I came with you." Their eyes met, and Ophelia saw something in Zachary's gaze that made her breath catch. Heat, yes, but also tenderness and hope, and a question he was not quite ready to ask aloud. She knew in that moment that he cared for her as more than a friend, that somewhere in the past few months of working side by side and sharing meals and talking about their lives, he had developed feelings for her, and she realized, with a mixture of fear and excitement, that she felt the same way about him. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, but it was a comfortable quiet, full of unspoken understanding. When they reached her cabin, Zachary dismounted and helped her down from Clover, his hands lingering on her waist, perhaps a moment longer than strictly necessary. "Can I see you tomorrow?" he asked. "I know it is Sunday, but I was thinking we could take a ride, maybe have a picnic down by the river, if you want." "I would like that," Ophelia said softly. "I would like that very much." Zachary smiled, and then, slowly, carefully, he leaned in and kissed her forehead, the gentlest brush of lips against skin. "Good night, Ophelia." "Good night, Zachary." She watched him ride away, her hand pressed to the spot where he had kissed her, her heart pounding in her chest. Everything was changing. She was changing. And for the first time, instead of feeling guilty about it, she felt grateful. Grateful to be alive, grateful to have a second chance at happiness, grateful for the kind, patient cowboy who had shown up at her husband's grave and offered to help her live again. The next morning, Ophelia woke early and packed a picnic basket with bread, cheese, cold chicken, and a jar of preserved peaches. She put on her riding clothes and braided her hair, and when Zachary arrived mid-morning, she was ready and waiting. They rode out along the Green River, following it upstream to a place where willows grew thick along the banks and the water ran clear over smooth stones. It was a beautiful spot, peaceful and private, and they spread a blanket in the shade and unpacked the food. "This is perfect," Zachary said, leaning back on his elbows and looking out at the water. "I come out here sometimes when I need to think. Something about the sound of the river calms my mind." "It is lovely," Ophelia agreed. She lay back on the blanket, staring up through the willow branches at the blue sky beyond. "I feel like I can breathe out here, away from everything." They ate their picnic slowly, talking easily about everything and nothing. Zachary told her stories about his work at the Rocking H, about the different characters among the ranch hands, about the time a bull chased him up a tree and he was stuck there for 2 hours. Ophelia told him about growing up in Missouri, about her strict mother who believed dancing was sinful, and her father who secretly taught her to play cards when her mother was not looking. "They sound complicated," Zachary observed. "They were. They are, I suppose. I should write to them more often, but I do not know what to say. They warned me about coming west, about marrying Thomas. I know they would think my situation proves they were right." Ophelia sighed. "But they were not right. They were just afraid, and I refuse to live my life in fear." "That is a good philosophy." Zachary rolled onto his side, propping his head on his hand so he could look at her. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. Are you afraid, of this I mean, of whatever is happening between us?" His voice was careful, vulnerable in a way she had not heard before. Ophelia thought about lying, about saying no, she was not afraid at all. But he deserved her honesty. "Yes," she admitted. "I am terrified. Part of me feels like I am betraying Thomas by caring about you. Part of me feels like it is too soon, that people will judge me, and part of me is just scared of getting hurt again, of losing someone else I care about." "Those are all very reasonable fears," Zachary said gently, "and I cannot promise that you will not get hurt, or that people will not judge. But I can promise that I care about you, Ophelia, more than I have cared about anyone in a long time, and I will never ask you to forget Thomas or pretend he did not exist. He was part of your life, part of who you are. I respect that." Tears spilled down Ophelia's cheeks, but they were not entirely sad tears. "How are you so perfect?" she whispered. "I am not perfect, far from it, but I have learned a few things from my own grief. I have learned that life is short and precious, and we have to grab hold of happiness when we find it. I have learned that honoring the dead does not mean stopping our own lives, and I have learned that love, when you are lucky enough to find it, is worth the risk of pain." Ophelia sat up and turned to face him fully. "I care about you too," she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I did not mean to, and I feel guilty about it sometimes, but I do. You make me laugh. You make me feel strong. You make me want to keep living instead of just surviving." Zachary reached out and brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "Then let us keep living together," he said softly. "We do not have to rush anything. We can take this as slow as you need. But I want to be with you, Ophelia. I want to see where this goes." "So do I," Ophelia breathed. And then she was leaning in, and he was meeting her halfway, and they were kissing, really kissing, for the first time. It was gentle and sweet and a little tentative, both of them feeling their way through this new territory. But it was also electric, full of promise and possibility, and when they finally pulled apart, Ophelia was breathing hard, and Zachary's eyes were dark with emotion. "I have wanted to do that for weeks," he confessed. "I have wanted you to do that for weeks," Ophelia replied, and they both laughed, the tension breaking into something lighter and happier. They spent the rest of the afternoon by the river, talking and kissing and simply being together. It felt momentous and also perfectly natural, as if this was always where they were heading, as if all the grief and pain and slow healing had been leading them to this moment. As the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, they packed up their picnic and rode back to the ranch. At the cabin, Zachary kissed Ophelia goodbye, a long, lingering kiss that made her knees weak and her heart race. "I will see you tomorrow?" he asked. "Every day if you want," Ophelia said, and she meant it. She did not want to be apart from him any more than necessary. "Every day sounds perfect." As autumn deepened into winter, Ophelia and Zachary's relationship deepened as well. He came to the ranch every evening after work, and they ate dinner together and talked for hours, and he always kissed her goodnight before he left. On Sundays, they went on long rides or stayed in by the fire when the weather was too cold, and those days became Ophelia's favorite, the ones she looked forward to all week. The people in Green River eventually stopped gossiping, or at least they did it more quietly. Ophelia continued to visit Thomas's grave regularly, but now, when she went, It was not to weep helplessly, but to talk to him, to tell him about her life and her decisions. She liked to think he would approve of Zachary, would be glad she had found someone to love her and take care of her. By December, when the first real snow began to fall, Zachary and Ophelia had settled into a rhythm that felt like a partnership. He helped her prepare the ranch for winter, making sure the cabin was sealed against the cold, that there was enough firewood stacked, that the cattle had access to shelter. She mended his clothes and cooked his meals and listened to his worries about the future. One evening, as they sat by the fire, with snow falling softly outside, Zachary took both of Ophelia's hands in his. "I need to ask you something," he said, his voice serious. "What is it?" Ophelia's heart started to pound. She had a feeling she knew what was coming, had been expecting it and hoping for it and dreading it all at once. "I love you," Zachary said simply. "I know it might seem fast, but I have never been more sure of anything in my life. You are strong and brave and beautiful, and I want to spend the rest of my life making you happy. Will you marry me, Ophelia?" Ophelia's breath caught. Marriage. A second chance. It was everything she wanted and everything that scared her. But looking into Zachary's eyes, seeing the love and hope there, she knew her answer. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you." Zachary's face broke into the biggest smile she had ever seen, and he pulled her into his arms, kissing her deeply. "You have made me the happiest man in Wyoming," he said against her lips. "When?" Ophelia asked when she could speak again. "When do you want to get married?" "Whenever you are ready, tomorrow, next month, next year. I will wait as long as you need." Ophelia thought about it. Part of her wanted to wait longer, to observe a full year of mourning for Thomas. But another part, the part that had learned from grief how short life could be, wanted to grab hold of this happiness immediately. "Spring," she decided, "when the wildflowers are blooming. I want to marry you in the spring." "Spring it is," Zachary agreed, and he kissed her again, and Ophelia felt like she was floating. She was going to get married again. She was going to have a future with this wonderful man who had appeared in her darkest hour and helped her find her way back to the light. They told people gradually, starting with the folks at the Rocking H and then spreading out to the town. The reactions were mostly positive, though a few people still thought it was too soon, that Ophelia should have waited longer. But their opinions mattered less and less to Ophelia. She knew her own heart. She knew Thomas would want her to be happy. And she knew that love, when you were fortunate enough to find it twice, was not something to be turned away out of fear or propriety. Winter passed slowly, but not unhappily. Zachary moved into the cabin after they announced their engagement, which caused another flurry of gossip, but Ophelia did not care. They slept in separate rooms, maintaining propriety, but having him there made the long, dark nights feel less lonely. They played cards by the fire, read to each other from the few books they owned, made plans for the future. Zachary talked about expanding the ranch, maybe buying more cattle, building a bigger barn. Ophelia talked about planting a larger garden, maybe getting more chickens, eventually having children. The thought of children made her both excited and sad. She had wanted children with Thomas, had dreamed of what their babies would look like. Now she would have children with Zachary instead, and that felt both right and strange. But she was learning to hold both feelings at once: gratitude for the past and hope for the future, grief for what was lost and joy for what was found. As the snow began to melt in March and the first green shoots appeared, Ophelia and Zachary began planning their wedding in earnest. It would be a simple affair, nothing fancy, just their closest friends and whoever from town wanted to come. Mrs. Chen was making Ophelia a dress from pale yellow cotton, the color of spring sunshine. Zachary bought a new suit from the catalog and looked so handsome when he tried it on that Ophelia could hardly breathe. On the morning of their wedding day in late April, Ophelia woke to sunshine streaming through the cabin windows and the sound of birds singing. The wildflowers were indeed blooming, covering the hillsides in splashes of color: purple lupine, yellow balsam root, red Indian paintbrush. It was a perfect day, the kind of day that felt like a gift. She dressed carefully in her new yellow dress, and Mrs. Chen came out to the ranch to help her with her hair, pinning it up and tucking in sprigs of baby's breath. "You look like a bride, Mrs. Chen said, smiling. "Happy and beautiful." "I feel happy," Ophelia admitted, "and a little nervous." "That is normal. Marriage is a big step, even the second time." Mrs. Chen squeezed her shoulder. But you and Zachary are good together. Anyone can see that." The ceremony was held outdoors, near the spot where Ophelia and Zachary had shared their first picnic by the river. A circuit preacher, who passed through Green River every few months, performed the service, and about 40 people showed up to witness it. Cal and several of the hands from the Rocking H were there, along with Robert Hawkins himself. Mrs. Patterson and her family came, and Mrs. Chen and her husband and several other townspeople who had befriended Ophelia over the past year. Zachary stood waiting for her in his new suit, his eyes lighting up when he saw her. Ophelia walked to him through the wildflowers, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. This was happening. She was getting married again. She was starting a new life. The preacher spoke about love and commitment, about the joy of finding a partner to walk through life with. He did not mention Ophelia's first marriage, which she appreciated. This day was about her and Zachary, about their future together. When it came time for the vows, Zachary took her hands and spoke clearly, his voice steady and sure. "I, Zachary Garrison, take you, Ophelia Zimmerman, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to love you, honor you, and cherish you for all the days of my life. I promise to stand by you in good times and bad, to support your dreams, and to build a life with you that is full of joy and meaning. I promise to never let you face the darkness alone." Ophelia's eyes filled with tears as she repeated her own vows, promising to love and honor and cherish Zachary, to build a life with him, to face whatever came together. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, and told Zachary he could kiss his bride, the kiss was sweet and tender and full of promise. Everyone cheered and clapped, and then there was food and music and dancing. Robert Hawkins had contributed a beef for roasting, and several people had brought dishes to share, so the celebration turned into a proper feast. Ophelia danced with Zachary, and then with Cal, and then with several other men, and she laughed more than she had in over a year. As evening fell and the party began to wind down, Ophelia found herself standing a little apart from everyone, looking out over the river. Zachary came to stand beside her, slipping his arm around her waist. "Happy?" he asked. "So happy," Ophelia said, leaning into him. "Thank you for this, for all of it, for finding me when I was lost, for helping me live again, for loving me." "Thank you for letting me," Zachary replied. "I promise I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret saying yes." That night, after everyone had left and they were alone in the cabin that was now truly theirs, Ophelia and Zachary lay together as husband and wife for the first time. It was tender and passionate and a little awkward, but it was also perfect in its imperfection. Two people learning each other, choosing each other, loving each other. Afterward, wrapped in Zachary's arms, Ophelia thought about the journey that had brought her here, the grief, the pain, the slow process of healing, the cowboy who had appeared in the cemetery and offered her a lifeline, the gradual transformation from widow to woman in love. It had not been easy, and there were still days when she missed Thomas with an ache that took her breath away, but she was learning to carry that grief alongside her joy, to honor the past while embracing the future. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," Zachary murmured back, his arms tightening around her. "Now sleep, wife. Tomorrow we start our life together." Ophelia closed her eyes, feeling safe and loved and hopeful. Whatever the future held, they would face it together. And that was enough. That was everything. The years that followed were good ones, full of hard work and simple pleasures. Zachary continued working at the Rocking H, and Ophelia ran their ranch with increasing confidence and skill. They expanded the herd, improved the cabin, built a new barn. Life was not always easy. There were droughts and harsh winters, sick cattle and lean times. But they faced everything together, and that made even the hard times bearable. In the spring of 1885, a year after their wedding, Ophelia gave birth to their first child, a healthy baby boy they named James Thomas Garrison. The middle name was in honor of Thomas Zimmerman, and Ophelia was grateful that Zachary suggested it without her having to ask. It felt right to carry Thomas's memory forward in this way, to make sure he was not forgotten. James was followed 2 years later by a daughter, Emma Rose, who had her mother's blue eyes and her father's dark hair. And then, 3 years after that, by another boy, Matthew, who was loud and boisterous from the day he was born. Ophelia loved being a mother, loved watching her children grow and learn and explore the world. She told them stories about Thomas sometimes, about the brave man who had been her first husband, who had died trying to protect others. She wanted them to know about him, to understand that their family had roots that went deep, that love could take many forms. Zachary was a wonderful father, patient and playful and fiercely protective. He taught James and Matthew to ride and rope, taught Emma to be strong and fearless. The children adored him, and watching him with them made Ophelia fall in love with him all over again, every single day. The ranch prospered over the years, growing from a small operation to one of the more successful spreads in the area. They never got rich, but they were comfortable, and more importantly, they were happy. They had friends in town, a place in the community, a life they had built together from the ashes of grief. Ophelia still visited Thomas's grave occasionally, though not as often as she once had. When she went, she brought wildflowers and sat on the grass and told him about her life. She told him about the children, about how the ranch was doing, about how Zachary took good care of her. She thanked him for the 2 years they had together, for the love he had shown her, for the foundation he had helped her build. And she liked to think, sitting there in the quiet cemetery, that Thomas was glad for her, that wherever he was at peace knowing she had found happiness again, that she had not let his death be the end of her story. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Zachary surprised Ophelia with a trip to see his family in Colorado. They left the children with Cal and his wife, who had become like family themselves, and took the train south. It was the first time Ophelia had been away from the ranch and the children for more than a day, and the freedom of it felt strange and wonderful. Zachary's parents welcomed her warmly, and his sister, Mary, hugged her like they had known each other forever. They spent a week in Colorado Springs, visiting and relaxing and simply enjoying each other's company without the constant demands of ranch life. On their last evening there, Zachary took Ophelia on a walk through the town, and they found themselves in front of a small cemetery. "This is where my brother is buried," Zachary said quietly, opening the gate. "I wanted to show you." They walked through the graveyard hand in hand until they came to a simple headstone, Samuel Garrison, beloved son and brother, 1860-1882. Ophelia knelt down and placed her hand on the stone, sending up a silent prayer of thanks to Samuel. If he had not died, Zachary would not have understood her grief the way he did. He would not have been in Green River that day in the cemetery. Their paths might never have crossed. "Thank you for sharing this with me," she said softly. "You shared Thomas with me," Zachary replied. "It felt right to share Samuel with you. They are both part of who we are, part of what brought us together." They stood there together for a while, honoring the dead, grateful for the living, acknowledging all the twists of fate and tragedy and grace that had woven their lives together. The train ride back to Wyoming was peaceful and companionable. They talked about their children, about whether they wanted more, about what they would do when they were too old to run the ranch themselves. They talked about everything and nothing, the comfortable conversation of two people who knew each other deeply and loved each other completely. When they finally arrived home, the children ran out to greet them, and Ophelia scooped Emma into her arms, while James and Matthew clung to Zachary's legs. Cal and his wife stood on the porch grinning, and the ranch looked beautiful in the late afternoon light, the mountains purple in the distance, the Green River sparkling. "It is good to be home," Ophelia said, and she meant it with her whole heart. The years continued to pass, each one bringing new challenges and new joys. James grew into a serious, thoughtful young man who loved the ranch and knew from an early age that he wanted to take it over someday. Emma was wild and free-spirited, always climbing trees and getting into mischief, but she had a kind heart and a fierce loyalty to her family. Matthew was the charmer, quick with a joke and easy with people, the one who could talk his way out of any trouble he got into. Ophelia and Zachary aged together gracefully, their love deepening with each passing year. Gray appeared in their hair, lines formed around their eyes, but they still looked at each other the way they had in those early days when they were figuring out what was between them. They still held hands while walking. They still kissed goodnight. They still talked for hours about anything and everything. On a warm summer evening in 1900, when Ophelia was 48 and Zachary was 52, they sat on the porch of the cabin watching the sunset. James was out checking the cattle with his new wife Laura. Emma was inside practicing piano, the notes drifting out through the open windows. Matthew was in town with friends, probably getting into some harmless trouble. "Can you believe it has been 16 years since we got married?" Ophelia said, resting her head on Zachary's shoulder. "Can you believe it has been 18 years since I found you crying in the cemetery?" Zachary replied. Ophelia smiled, thinking back to that day, to how broken she had been, how certain that her life was over. "That was the worst day of my life," she said, "and the day you offered to help me was the beginning of the best part of my life. Strange how things work out." "Not so strange," Zachary said. "Sometimes terrible things happen so that other wonderful things can follow. I would never have wished for Thomas to die or for my brother to die, but I also would not trade the life we have built together for anything." "Neither would I." Ophelia turned to kiss him, and it was sweet and familiar, and still managed to make her heart flutter, even after all these years. "You saved my life, you know. When you told me you wanted to help me live again, you meant it literally. I do not think I would have survived that grief without you." "You would have," Zachary said firmly. "You are the strongest person I know, but I am glad I could be there, glad I could help make it easier, and I am glad you let me." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun sank below the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink and purple. The ranch stretched out before them, solid and prosperous, a testament to their hard work and determination. Their children were healthy and happy. Their lives were full of love and meaning. They had come so far from that terrible day in the cemetery, from the depths of grief and despair. Ophelia thought about the journey, about all the choices that had led her here. Choosing to marry Thomas and come west, surviving his death, accepting Zachary's help, allowing herself to love again, having children, building a life, creating something beautiful from the ruins of tragedy. None of it had been easy, but all of it had been worth it. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" Zachary asked. "For everything, for being patient, for being kind, for showing up every day until I was ready to live again, for loving me and our children, for being exactly who I needed when I needed it most." Zachary pulled her closer, kissing the top of her head. "You do not have to thank me for loving you. That is the easiest thing I have ever done." Inside, Emma finished her piano practice and came out to join them, curling up on the porch with a book. A little while later, Matthew came home from town, full of stories about his evening. James and Laura arrived as darkness fell, and they all went inside for a late dinner. The family gathered around the table, laughing and talking and simply being together. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed and the house was quiet, Ophelia stood at the bedroom window looking out at the starlit sky. Zachary came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Everything," Ophelia said. "The past, the present, the future. How lucky I am. How grateful I am for this life we have built." "I am grateful too," Zachary murmured. "Every single day, I wake up grateful." They stood there together, looking out at their land, their home, the life they had created, and Ophelia felt a sense of peace so profound it brought tears to her eyes. She had survived loss that could have destroyed her. She had found love when she thought she would never love again. She had built a family and a future from the ashes of her grief. She had learned that the human heart was capable of holding both sorrow and joy, that honoring the past did not mean giving up on the future, that healing was possible even when it seemed impossible. Thomas would always be part of her story, a chapter that shaped her but did not define her. And Zachary was her present and her future, the man who had shown up in her darkest hour and offered her hope, who had been patient and kind and true, who had loved her back to life. As they climbed into bed that night, Ophelia snuggled close to Zachary, feeling safe and cherished and completely at peace. "I love you," she whispered. "I love you too," Zachary whispered back. "Forever." And Ophelia believed him, because he had already proven it 1,000 times over. This was her happily ever after, hard-won and deeply treasured. This was the life she had fought to build, the love she had chosen, the family she had created. And it was more than she ever could have imagined in those dark days in the cemetery, when a kind cowboy had found her crying and offered to help her live again. The seasons continued their eternal cycle, and the Garrison Ranch thrived through the turn of the century and beyond. James eventually took over the day-to-day operations, running the ranch with the same dedication his parents had shown. Emma married a school teacher and moved to Cheyenne, but visited often. Matthew ended up working for the railroad, always the adventurous one, but he never failed to come home for the holidays. Ophelia and Zachary grew old together, their hair turning silver, their bodies slowing down, but their love as strong as ever. They became grandparents and then great-grandparents, and their cabin was always full of children and laughter. When they walked through town, people greeted them with genuine affection and respect, remembering the young widow and the cowboy who had helped her rebuild her life. On a crisp autumn day in 1920, when Ophelia was 68 and Zachary was 72, they took one final ride together, out to the place by the river where they had shared their first picnic, where they had gotten married. The leaves were turning gold, and the air smelled of autumn and wood smoke and the promise of winter. They spread a blanket, and Ophelia laid her head in Zachary's lap, looking up at him through the dapple sunlight. His face was deeply lined now, weathered by decades of sun and wind, but to her, he was as handsome as the day they met. His eyes were still the same stormy gray, still full of love when he looked at her. "Do you remember the first time we came here?" Ophelia asked. "Of course. You told me you cared about me. I kissed you. It changed everything." Zachary stroked her hair gently. "Best day of my life, besides our wedding day and the days our children were born." "Mine too." Ophelia reached up and touched his face. "I have been so happy, Zachary. I want you to know that. Even with all the hard times, I have been happier than I ever thought possible. You gave me that." "We gave it to each other," Zachary corrected gently. "You chose to live, Ophelia. You chose to heal, to love again, to build a life. I was just lucky enough to get to be part of it." They stayed by the river for hours, talking about everything and nothing, remembering their life together, marveling at how fast the years had gone and how much they had accomplished. When the sun began to sink low, they packed up and rode slowly back to the ranch, taking their time, savoring every moment. Zachary lived another 5 years after that day, finally passing peacefully in his sleep one winter night with Ophelia beside him. She mourned him deeply, but differently than she had mourned Thomas. This grief was softer, tinged with gratitude for the 41 years they had shared, for the life they had built, for the love that had sustained them through everything. She did not feel lost the way she had when Thomas died. Zachary had taught her how to keep living, and that lesson stayed with her even after he was gone. Ophelia lived another 8 years, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, still sharp and witty and full of stories about the old days. When she finally passed, on a warm spring day in 1933 when she was 81 years old, she was buried between Thomas and Zachary in the Green River Cemetery, the three of them together in death as they had been intertwined in life. On her gravestone, James had inscribed a simple message that captured everything his mother had been, everything she had survived and built and loved. Ophelia Zimmerman Garrison, beloved wife and mother, 1852-1933. She learned to live again. And in the town of Green River, for generations afterward, people told the story of the widow who had been crying in the cemetery and the cowboy who had offered to help her live again. They told it as a love story, which it was. They told it as an inspiration, which it was. They told it as proof that even in the darkest times, hope could be found, love could be discovered, and life could begin again. And that, more than anything, was the truth of Ophelia's story, the legacy she left behind, that with courage and kindness and the willingness to let others help, even the most broken hearts could heal, and even the darkest nights could lead to the brightest dawns.